This is the moment the world stopped being the one you thought you understood. And almost no one in the mainstream media is explaining why. 3 days ago, Israel struck a port. Not in Gaza, not in Lebanon, not in Iran's Persian Gulf coastline where the cameras have been pointed for months. Israel struck the port of Anzali on the Caspian Sea, a body of water that sits inside what Russia considers its own strategic backyard, a port that is not just Iranian infrastructure, it is a living artery connecting Russian military hardware to Iranian forces, a critical node in a 7,200-kilometer trade and supply corridor that Russia has spent years building and depends on for its war effort in Ukraine and its entire sanctions-busting economic survival. Western news covered the Anzali strike in 3 paragraphs and moved on. That was a catastrophic failure of editorial judgment, because what Israel just did is not a footnote. It is a rupture. It is the moment this conflict expanded from the Middle East into Russian strategic space in a way that Moscow cannot absorb quietly, cannot ignore diplomatically, and cannot answer with silence indefinitely. The next move belongs to Putin, and the options nobody is currently discussing in the mainstream media are exactly the ones most likely to arrive first, with consequences that will reach your gas prices, your stock portfolio, your retirement account, and the stability of a world your generation spent decades helping to build. In this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly what was struck, exactly why Russia cannot let it pass, exactly what Putin's real options are, and exactly what happens to global markets, energy prices, and Western security if he exercises any one of them. Stay with me to the end, because the next move on this board changes everything. To understand why the Anzali strike is so significant, you need to understand something that most Western news coverage has completely ignored: a trade and military corridor so important to Russia that losing access to it is not just an inconvenience. It is an existential economic threat. It is called the International North-South Transport Corridor, and it is the spine of everything Russia and Iran have been building together over the last 3 years. Picture a 7,200-kilometer route stretching from Mumbai in India, northward through Iran, across the Caspian Sea, through Russia, and into northern Europe. The World Bank has assessed that this corridor cuts transit time between India and Russia by roughly 40% compared to the Suez Canal route. It cuts shipping costs by 30%. And since 2022, since Russia invaded Ukraine and the West responded with the most comprehensive sanctions package since the Cold War, this corridor has become something far more important than a trade route. It has become Russia's lifeline, its sanctions bypass, its alternative to a Western financial and commercial system that has been deliberately weaponized against it. Traffic volumes on this corridor climbed sharply through 2023 and 2024. Port capacity was expanded, rail connections were upgraded, cross-Caspian ferry infrastructure was built out at a pace that reflected genuine strategic urgency, not routine infrastructure development, but a country building an alternative supply chain under wartime pressure. And according to multiple Western intelligence assessments cited by the Associated Press and Der Spiegel, this corridor has been doing something beyond moving commercial goods. Russian military technology, targeting intelligence, drone components, weapons systems, has been flowing into the conflict theater through supply channels that run directly through this corridor. Not just trade goods, military hardware, moving from Russian stockpiles through Iranian territory and into the hands of forces that are actively engaged in a conflict that has now killed tens of thousands of people. Anzali is not a side stop on this corridor. It is the primary Iranian gateway on the Caspian leg. Container terminals, bulk grain storage, dual-use logistics infrastructure built through years of direct Russian-Iranian cooperation. It is the main door of the most important sanctions-busting military supply corridor in the world. Israel just kicked it in. Now I need to explain the 2 ways to read what Israel just did, because both interpretations are disturbing and both lead to the same destination. The first reading is pure military logic: destroy the logistics node, slow the pipeline, complicate the flow of Russian military technology into Iranian hands, degrade the supply chain that has been keeping Iranian forces equipped and operational, clean, aggressive, strategically coherent. If you can interrupt the corridor that connects Russian military capability to Iranian forces, you make Iran weaker, you slow the flow of weapons and intelligence that have been used against Israeli forces and Israeli-aligned interests across the region. That is a legitimate military objective. Brutal, escalatory, but logical. The second reading is darker, and it is the one that serious analysts at institutions like the RAND Corporation and Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies are quietly discussing. What if the port was never the real target? What if the calculation in Tel Aviv was this: strike infrastructure so deeply woven into Russian strategic space that Moscow cannot absorb the blow quietly? Force Russia into a response that pulls it formally into the conflict. Because if Russia responds with direct military force against Israel, Article 5 of the NATO treaty becomes a live conversation overnight. The full weight of Western collective defense gets pulled into a confrontation with Moscow, and Israel's position, which has faced growing Western pressure over its military conduct, is suddenly locked back inside Western existential interests in a way that makes political distance from Tel Aviv impossible. In other words, provoke Russia. Force the West to choose sides. Make Israel untouchable again. Both the RAND analysts and the IISS scholars have pushed back on this second reading. Their argument is that Israeli strategic doctrine has consistently avoided direct NATO-Russia escalation because the nuclear dimension of that scenario is an existential risk that cancels any tactical gain. That is a fair point. Israel is not suicidal. It does not pursue strategies that end in nuclear confrontation. But here is what both interpretations agree on. The Anzali strike is a qualitative escalation beyond anything Israel has previously attempted in this conflict. Someone at the highest level authorized this, and the question hanging over every intelligence service in Moscow, Washington, London, and Beijing tonight is the same. What did the people who authorized it expect to come back? Russia has not struck back with military force. Do not read that as weakness. Do not read that as acceptance. Read it as a government working methodically through a menu of graduated responses, options that can impose far deeper costs than a single missile strike, sustained over months and years in ways that are difficult to attribute, impossible to deter with conventional military force, and devastating in their cumulative effect. Let me walk you through what Putin's real options look like, because none of them have been adequately explained in the mainstream coverage. The first option is Syrian airspace. Russia controls the air defense environment over Syria. It operates from Khmeimim Air Base in Latakia. It has the technical capability to close Syrian airspace to Israeli aircraft right now, today, without firing a single shot. For years, Israel has conducted hundreds of strikes on Syrian territory against Iranian-linked targets, and Russia has watched without intervening. There was a tacit understanding. Russia would not interfere with Israeli operations in Syria as long as Israel did not cross certain lines. The Anzali strike crossed a line. The tacit understanding is under pressure in a way it has never been before. If Russia closes Syrian airspace to Israeli aircraft, Israel loses one of its most important operational theaters. Its ability to interdict Iranian weapons flows through Syria, a cornerstone of Israeli strategy for nearly a decade, collapses overnight. The second option is what analysts consider the most dangerous escalation short of direct military confrontation. S-300 air defense systems transferred to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Hezbollah has a large missile arsenal. What it lacks is advanced air defense capability, the systems that would allow it to contest Israeli air dominance over northern Israel and protect its own infrastructure from Israeli airstrikes. The introduction of S-300 systems into that environment, not Russia's most advanced platforms, but enough, transforms the air war over northern Israel in ways that Israeli Air Force doctrine has not been tested against in this conflict. Every Israeli pilot operating over Lebanon would face a fundamentally different threat environment. Every Israeli strike planning cycle would have to account for air defense suppression missions that currently are not necessary. The entire tempo and cost of Israeli operations in the north changes. The UN Security Council and the European Union have stated clearly that transferring advanced weapons to non-state armed groups violates international legal frameworks. Russia knows this. The question is whether, after Anzali, Russia's calculation about the cost of crossing that line has changed. The third option is deeper, undeclared support for Iran. Russia has already been supplying targeting intelligence and military hardware through channels that are consequential without being formally acknowledged. Enhanced support, faster delivery, more advanced systems, better intelligence sharing does not require a public announcement. It does not create a headline. It simply makes Iran more capable over time, more resilient under pressure, and better positioned to inflict costs on Israeli and American forces operating in the region. And the fourth option, the one that almost no Western coverage has mentioned, is Caspian commercial pressure. Russia has substantial influence over the energy and trade flows of Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, two countries that depend on Caspian corridor functionality for the revenue that funds their domestic stability. If Russia wants to send a message to Western-aligned interests about the cost of striking infrastructure in its strategic space, it has tools that do not require a single soldier or a single missile. Tools that move through commodity markets, shipping lanes, and energy contracts. Tools whose effects are felt not in Tel Aviv, but in Frankfurt, London, and New York. In the price of oil, in shipping costs, in the inflation numbers that determine whether your retirement savings hold their value. This is where I need to connect what is happening in the Caspian to what it means for you. Because this is not just a story about a port strike in a country most Americans cannot find on a map. This is a story about the price you will pay at the gas pump, the value of the stocks in your retirement account, and the stability of the global economy that your generation built and that your children and grandchildren depend on. The International Energy Agency and S&P Global have assessed that global energy markets were already stretched to near their pressure limit before the Anzali strike. The Strait of Hormuz disruption, the Ras Laffan shutdown in Qatar, the Red Sea shipping constraints, every one of these has already pushed the global energy system closer to a threshold where a single additional disruption produces price signals that cascade outward through the entire global economy. The Caspian corridor is not peripheral to that system. Kazakhstan is one of the world's largest landlocked oil exporters. Azerbaijan moves substantial energy volumes through Caspian infrastructure. Both depend on that corridor for the revenue that keeps their governments functioning. A port strike in northern Iran does not stay in northern Iran. It becomes a factor in shipping costs, in commodity prices, in the cost of manufactured goods, in the inflation that determines whether the money you saved over 30 years of work buys what you thought it would buy when you needed it. A port on the Caspian Sea becomes a factor in the price of groceries in your city, not through some abstract economic theory, through a chain of consequences that is documented, measurable, and real, and almost nobody in the mainstream media is explaining it. Now, let me tell you about something that has received almost zero coverage in Western media, something that I believe is the most consequential long-term consequence of the Anzali strike. 2 years ago, according to Reuters and Foreign Affairs, Russia offered Iran a formal mutual defense treaty. The structure was explicit. An attack on either party triggers a military obligation from the other, a direct equivalent of NATO's Article 5, a formal alliance between Moscow and Tehran that would have created the most significant geopolitical realignment since the end of the Cold War. Iran said no. The reformist faction inside Iranian parliament, connected to intelligence elements that still believed a return to Western engagement was possible, blocked it. Their logic was straightforward. Accepting a formal defense pact with Moscow permanently closes the door on any deal with the West and locks Iran inside Russian orbit with no exit. For a country that has spent 4 decades trying to preserve strategic independence, avoiding binding alliances that remove its options, this was a bridge too far. That was not an irrational calculation given what they knew at the time. But the world they were calculating in no longer exists. After Anzali, the internal argument for refusing that treaty is structurally broken. Iran has been struck repeatedly by Israel and the United States. Russia has supported it unofficially without formal obligation. And now Israel has struck Russian-adjacent infrastructure with apparent impunity, precisely because no formal defense commitment existed to stop it. The reformist faction's argument that strategic independence is more valuable than a formal alliance ran directly into the reality that strategic independence without a formal protector leaves you vulnerable to strikes your informal partner has no obligation to prevent. Here is the prediction worth writing down right now. When this conflict reaches its endpoint, when the ceasefire is finalized, when the nuclear negotiations conclude, when Iran begins the long process of rebuilding, Iran will come back to that treaty conversation. And the political conditions inside Tehran for accepting it will be completely different from what they were 2 years ago. Not because of ideology, not because of preference, because of the structural logic of what the Anzali strike just changed. A formal Russia-Iran mutual defense treaty, the thing that failed 2 years ago, may now be the inevitable outcome of a conflict that was supposed to weaken Iran. The war that was meant to isolate Iran may instead produce the deepest formal alliance between Moscow and Tehran in history. And that alliance, if it is signed, changes the geopolitical map of Eurasia in ways that will define the next 50 years. Step back from the port. Step back from the Caspian. Look at the whole board. What does the military picture actually look like right now? Because the public narrative and the operational reality have been telling different stories for weeks. Iron Dome was presented to the world as a near-perfect defensive system. Iranian strikes have penetrated it on multiple documented occasions, not because the system collapsed, but because no air defense is absolute when the volume and variety of incoming threats reaches a certain threshold. The system is extraordinary. It is not impenetrable. The air campaign against Iran was framed publicly as a display of decisive Israeli air superiority. What independent military analysts and Associated Press reporting show is a campaign that reached the boundary of achievable objectives on day 12, not day 13, not day 14, day 12. The targets that could be hit were hit. The targets that required deeper penetration, hardened underground facilities, dispersed mobile systems, redundant command infrastructure proved more resistant than the public framing suggested. Gaza remains unresolved. Hezbollah has inflicted real casualties along Israel's northern border throughout this period. The Houthis have constrained Israeli-linked commercial shipping through the Red Sea more effectively than every military strike against Yemen has managed to reverse. Iran continues to launch strikes, continues to hold operational control of the Strait of Hormuz, and has not experienced organizational collapse despite sustained military pressure from both Israel and the United States. The Begin Sadat Center and the International Institute for Strategic Studies offer a reasonable counter-argument. Degrading an adversary's military capacity is cumulative, and the absence of collapse does not mean failure. Strategic campaigns are rarely settled in a single phase. That argument has weight. It is true. But here is what the pattern also shows. When a military actor that has operated within a defined perimeter begins extending operations into the Caspian Sea, into Russian strategic space, into logistics corridors that connect Central Asian energy exporters to Northern European markets, that extension is not the behavior of an actor with surplus options. It is the behavior of an actor searching for a lever that its existing toolkit has not found. The Anzali strike tells you something important about the state of Israeli strategic options. It tells you that the options within the established perimeter were not producing the outcomes required. And so the perimeter was expanded into territory whose rules of engagement are completely different from anything this conflict has operated under before, which brings us to the question that matters most. What happens next? Russia will not respond with a direct military strike on Israel, not because the capability is missing, not because the provocation was insufficient, but because the graduated options available to Moscow, Syrian airspace, S-300 transfers, enhanced Iranian support, Caspian commercial pressure, can impose costs over time that a single missile cannot match in depth or duration. Russia plays long. It always has. This is a country that waited 8 years after the Maidan Revolution before launching its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. This is a government that absorbed Western sanctions, reorganized its economy around alternative partners, built new supply chains, developed new payment systems, and then moved when it was ready, not when it was provoked. Putin does not react. He accumulates. He positions. He waits for the moment when the cost-benefit calculation favors action. And then he acts decisively. The Anzali strike gave him something. It gave him a grievance he can point to, a justification for responses that would previously have been condemned by the international community as unprovoked escalation. Israel struck infrastructure in Russian strategic space. Russia's response, when it comes, will be framed not as aggression, but as proportional reaction to a provocation. And in the court of international opinion, particularly among the global South nations that have refused to join Western sanctions against Russia, that framing will have significant traction. So watch for the S-300 systems in Lebanon. Watch for a radar signature in southern Lebanon that Hezbollah could not have generated 18 months ago. Watch for the moment a system appears in the field that traces its origin to a decision made in Moscow in the week after Anzali. When that moment arrives, and if Russia chooses this option, it will arrive within weeks. The air war over northern Israel changes permanently. Every Israeli operation in Lebanon becomes more costly. Every pilot faces a threat environment they have not trained against in this context. And the pressure on Israel from its own military establishment, from its own Air Force commanders who understand what S-300 systems mean for their operational planning, becomes a domestic political crisis on top of everything else. Watch also for what happens in the Caspian itself. Russia has not publicly announced any change in its Caspian policy, but the shipping data, the port activity, the commercial flows through Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, these are the signals that will tell you what Moscow is actually doing before any official statement confirms it. A port strike in northern Iran that disrupts corridor functionality does not just hurt Iran. It hurts the commercial interests of countries that Russia has influence over, and Russia can use that influence to redirect flows, pressure compliance, and send messages to Western-aligned interests about the real cost of striking infrastructure in its strategic space. Let me tell you what this means for your financial life, because I am going to be honest with you in a way that most financial commentators will not. The global economy in 2026 is operating without the buffers it had in previous crises. The spare oil production capacity that cushioned the 2008 shock is not available in the same way. The coordinated central bank response that cushioned the COVID shock has been exhausted by years of inflation fighting and interest rate cycles that have left governments with less fiscal room than they have had in decades. The supply chain resilience that was supposed to be rebuilt after COVID has been partially rebuilt and then partially disrupted again by the cascade of geopolitical events that began with Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 and has not stopped since. Into this stretched, pressured, near-limit global system, add the following: the Strait of Hormuz disruption, the Ras Laffan shutdown, the Red Sea constraints. And now the Anzali strike with its implications for Caspian corridor functionality and Russian graduated responses that include the potential for energy market pressure. If Russia closes Syrian airspace to Israeli aircraft, oil markets react. If Russia transfers S-300 systems to Hezbollah and the air war over northern Israel intensifies, oil markets react. If Russia deepens undeclared Iranian support and Iran's military capability is enhanced, oil markets react. If Caspian corridor functionality is disrupted and Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan energy flows are affected, commodity markets react. Each of these reactions individually is manageable. The global economy has absorbed individual shocks before. What it has not absorbed, what no economy has ever successfully absorbed without significant disruption, is multiple simultaneous shocks to interconnected systems that are already at their pressure limit. We are in that territory now. And the Anzali strike just opened a new front in a conflict that was already producing more simultaneous shocks than any single crisis in recent memory. What does this mean practically? Oil prices that are already elevated will face upward pressure from every Russian response that restricts supply or increases regional instability. Gold, which has already moved significantly as a safe haven, will continue to attract capital from investors who are losing confidence in the stability of conventional assets. The US dollar, which benefits from safe haven flows in the short term, faces longer-term pressure from any development that accelerates the de-dollarization agenda that Russia and China have been pursuing for years. And stock markets, particularly energy sector stocks, defense sector stocks, and any company with significant supply chain exposure to the Middle East, the Caspian region, or the trade routes that connect them, will move in ways that reward preparation and punish complacency. I am not a financial advisor. I am not telling you what to buy or sell, but I am telling you that the people who understand what happened at Anzali, who understand what Russia's graduated response options mean for global markets, are positioning differently from the people who read the 3-paragraph news summary and moved on. Let me leave you with the question that I think matters most. The question that serious analysts, the ones who are not appearing on cable television, the ones who are writing the intelligence assessments that land on the desks of finance ministers and central bank governors, are asking tonight. The people who authorized the Anzali strike understood the military calculus. They understood what a strike on that corridor would do to Iran's supply chain. They understood the tactical logic. The open question, the one that keeps the serious analysts awake, is whether they fully understood which rule book they were closing and which one they were opening in its place. For decades, there has been an informal set of rules governing the conflict between Israel, Iran, and Russia. Strikes within certain perimeters, restraint at certain thresholds, tacit understandings about which targets trigger which responses. Those rules allowed a cold conflict to remain cold enough to be managed, destructive, costly, dangerous, but not catastrophic. The Anzali strike reached across the Caspian into Russian strategic space. It struck infrastructure that Russia has spent years building and depends on for its war effort and its economic survival. It said, implicitly but unmistakably, that no perimeter is permanent. No tacit understanding is unbreakable. No space is safe. When you change the rules, you do not get to choose which new rules replace them. The new rules are negotiated by every actor that was operating under the old ones. And Putin is now at that negotiating table, not with words, not with diplomacy, but with a menu of options that can reshape the conflict, reshape the markets, and reshape the balance of power in ways that the architects of the Anzali strike may not have fully calculated. Russia plays long. It accumulates, it positions, and then, when the moment is right, it moves. The board just changed shape. The next move belongs to Moscow, and what Moscow decides in the coming weeks will determine whether this conflict remains a regional crisis or becomes something that your grandchildren study in history class as the moment the world changes. Stay close. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because when Russia moves, and it will move, we will break it down before the mainstream coverage has finished writing its 3-paragraph summary. This is not the end of anything. This is the moment before everything that comes next.